All right, so in this video, we're just going to do examples of the chain rule and just kind of seeing how they're set up, all right, what they should look like when you get your final answer. Right. So this one, we're going to take the derivative of sine to the fourth x. So this is a notation thing with the trig functions we do. To kind of limit the number of parentheses that we need, we put the exponent right here rather than right there where you would think it should be. So this is actually the same as sine of x raised to the fourth power. Again, whenever you see these parentheses, that's a good idea that you're probably using the chain rule. And the chain rule says I start from the outside in. So the first thing I do if I'm coming from the outside, and the outside of that parentheses is this exponent 4. So that's the first thing I have to do. And then I have to do the sine. So my derivative now. Okay, how do I take the derivative of an exponent of 4? Well, I do the power rule. I bring the 4 down, and I subtract 1 from the exponent. Again, the thing inside the parentheses around is the same. So I keep that sine of x in there. So I'm just bringing that 4 down to the front and subtracting 1 from the exponent. And then I multiply by the derivative of the inside, which is cosine. So I did the derivative of the exponent first, and then the derivative of the trig function second. And you can see the original sign that was on the inside here stays there, and then I take its derivative later. All right, cosine of 5x squared plus x. Again, we have this parentheses, which is a good clue of the chain rule. And again, thinking about from outside in, outside of that parentheses, the first thing we see is cosine, and then we see the polynomial. So our derivative, all right, we start with the derivative of the outside. The derivative of cosine is negative sine. Normally we would just put an x in there, but now we're going to put the thing that started in the parentheses. Again, we haven't taken the derivative of that yet. All right, so all we did was take the derivative of cosine, and now we multiply by the derivative of the thing that was inside of it, which is going to be 10x plus 1. All right, so again, outside in, we just take the derivative of cosine and keep this the same, and then we take its derivative later. All right, e to the cosine x, all right, f prime of x. All right, this one might not be as obvious because there's no parentheses, but e to the x is a normal function, and then instead of having an x up here, we have a cosine of x. All right, so cosine is going in place of the exponential. So cosine is technically inside of this exponential function. So really the first thing we actually get to is the exponential. All right, so we take the derivative of the exponential first, and the derivative of any e to something is the same thing. All right, so e to the x doesn't change when we take its derivative, so e to the cosine is not going to change when we take its derivative. But then we have to multiply by the derivative of the thing that was on the inside, which is negative sine of x. All right, so being able to identify A, that you have to do the chain rule, and then B, which function is inside the other is kind of the most difficult part of the chain rule. Right? But for an exponential, right, the thing in the exponent is in the exponential function. All right, sine of cosine of cosine. All right, you can do the chain rule as many times as you need to, have ever many functions there are. All right, so we have this sine on the outside. On the inside of that, there's this cosine. And inside of that, there's this cosine. And then finally, we just have an x. Once you get down to just a single x, there's no more chain rule to do. All right, so our derivative. The first thing we do is take the derivative of the most outside thing. Derivative of sine is cosine. And we keep everything else on the inside of that the same. There's a cosine, oops, and another cosine. All right, so that's the sine part done, so I can kind of cross it out. Now I move into the next thing. The next thing I do is take the derivative of that cosine, which is negative sine, but I keep the thing on the inside the same. So I've gotten rid of that cosine now. And now I have last step, take derivative of that last thing on the inside, which is negative sine. All right, so and now I'm done because I have nothing on the inside left. All right, so I took the derivative of sine, it's cosine, but everything on the inside stayed the same. Then I take the derivative of cosine, which is negative sine, but everything else on the inside stays the same. And then I take the derivative of cosine, which is done. All right, so just one thing at a time. Take the derivative just of the outside thing, keep everything else in the parentheses the same. All right, this is our last example. And this is kind of starting to mix rules together. So this is kind of where we're going to get over the next couple of class periods. All right, we have this red function, and it's being multiplied by this blue function. All right, so again, whenever we have multiplication between two different things, when we take its derivative, we have to do the product rule. So the product rule says I keep one of the functions, so I'll keep the red function the exact same. And then I multiply that by the derivative of the other one. So I take the derivative of that right-hand function, and that's a chain rule, similar to our first example. I do the power rule first. By just bringing that exponent down and subtracting 1. But the chain rule says I also have to multiply this by the derivative of the inside of that parentheses. All right, so all of this, let's kind of make it more clear. All right, this is my original red function. And this whole thing is just the derivative of that blue function. And now I'm going to add, I'm going to switch them. Now I'm going to keep the blue function and multiply this by the derivative of the red function. Really similar. Product rule, or not product rule, power rule. Bring the exponent down and subtract 1. And then multiply by the derivative of the thing on the inside. All right, so again, just to make it clear, this is my original blue function, and all of this is the derivative of my red function. All right, so now we're going to start mixing all these different rules together, remembering how to do the product and quotient rule still, but inside of those we might have to do the chain rule as well. So the derivatives that we did in this case needed the chain rule, but overall the big thing was the product rule. All right, so this is where we're going to be able to go in the next few classes. All right, so in class we're just going to basically do every single type of chain rule possible. All right, trig functions instead of trig functions, polynomials instead of trig functions, exponentials inside of polynomials, all this kind of stuff. I figure out what's on the inside, how do you take these derivatives and simplify the chain rule. And then we have time, we'll also look at some AP questions to see how the chain rule might be used in a multiple choice AP question. All right, so that's the chain rule. Again, a long video just for a single rule, but this gets used so much throughout the whole rest of the class. That's really important that you kind of understand the chain rule. And we're going to spend 2 days practicing it.